Nice to see you. So we're in. I think today will be the concluding share on halachas of Maaser, and I think you also sent me a couple of questions that you wanted me to cover in the WhatsApp. Is that right? Yes, I'll get to them also. If I don't, please remind me. So just I think we spoke last week. We spent several weeks speaking about Tzedaka in general, and then last week we spoke about the obligation of Maaser in particular, and I clarified that there's really there's an overlap, obviously, between the two sets of halachas, but in many respects, these are two separate halachas. Everyone has an obligation to give tzedakah. No Jew should not give tzedakah. We should all give tzedakah to people that are needy. And we discussed that the trigger of tzedakah doesn't demand for me to set aside a fixed sum, but rather, as in when people approach me, we need to give to them. We need to give tzedakah. By contrast, Maaser is, and the mitzvah of tzedakah, by the way, is generally understood as per the Pesukim to be something that crunches down to an oni, to a person who's impoverished, a person who needs. The mitzvah of Maaser, in contrast, is a very different mitzvah. It demands of one that one should set aside. So again, the mitzvah of tzedakah has no fixed calculation. You just have to give as needs based. The mitzvah of Maaser, on the other hand, demands of one to give it to set money aside. You have to tithe. You have to set money aside, even though there's no particular needy person in front of one, and one then has to look to distribute, even though there's no person there specifically that needs. So this is the difference between the mitzvah of Maaser and the mitzvah of tzedakah. In addition, and we'll look at this in more detail, the mitzvah of tzedakah, based on the Pesukim, is really a mitzvah of giving to aniyim, whereas the mitzvah of an impoverished person, whereas the mitzvah of Maaser is a more generic mitzvah of giving to anything that is a deserving cause, as long as it's not an obligation. So the mitzvah of tzedakah is given ultimately to someone who's poor, someone who needs the money. So if you give money to a poor person, you're doing the mitzvah of tzedakah. If you give money to a hospital in order that it can look after poor people who are unable to afford the fees, there's also a mitzvah of tzedakah. If you give money to a shul in order to be able to afford Sidurim, it's not that type of tzedakah. You're not giving to an oni. There's no poor person there that specifically needs it. On the other hand, it's a communal need, and therefore that can be given from Maaser, but it's not it's not oni triggered. It's not triggered by an impoverished person. So we've got these two overlapping mitzvahs, but they're not entirely identical in their characteristics. Now let's spend a few minutes talking about revisiting how one does the Maaser calculation and on what the obligation of tithing falls. So the basic obligation of Maaser is to give a tenth of one's income, and this is income once taxes and expenses are deducted from it. So if I'm earning 100 a year and the government immediately takes 40% of it, so my net income is only 60 a year, I only have to take Maaser from that 60, not from the full 100. In addition, if there are expenses associated with earning the money, where the expenses are triggered just by earning the money, then again, these expenses are deducted from my Maaser. So I've got my 60 a year that I'm earning after the 40% tax has been taken, but I end up spending 10 of that 60 on babysitting fees, or the tax, or the my microphone is not working properly. Check your microphone, continue recording. Don't know why the microphone's not working properly. I'll record it on this then instead. Sorry,
would like rent count? Because, for example, if you're left with 30 pounds right now, but what if your rent for the whole year was 30 pounds? And therefore,
so again, in my scenario, where we'll come to rent in a moment, but in my scenario, the reason you can deduct the fees for commuting and the reason you can deduct the babysitting fees are because they are directly caused by the very thing that's bringing your money in. So even though you think you're earning 100, the truth is by the time you take off tax of 40, and by the time you take off the 24 childcare fees and the 10 for commuting, the profit I'm making through my working is 30, and therefore I'm only obligated to take Maaser on £30 a year. This is assuming 30 is enough to live off. We'll talk about a case where it's not enough to live off for now, but this is assuming 30 is sufficient to live off. Then my obligation of Maaser will be £3 a year, 10% of the 30. Yes.
Just to clarify, why is it expenses?
What's going on over here? Sorry, I don't know if this is. Fine, we'll see if this works. Yeah. Sorry, can I re-clarify?
Why you doing something like babysitting?
If the babysitting is necessary because you're working, in other words, you're not doing the babysitting because you want to go out at night and go for a walk or go to a simcha, the childcare fees are triggered by you working. So it's true that you're earning £60 post-tax, but you're also spending £20 a year in order to allow you to earn that money. So that's a work expense, and therefore that would be deducted. Correct. So daycare, anything that's only being spent because of your need to earn money, that would be deducted from the income before you do your Maaser calculation.
So it changes every month.
Yes, it could change every month or every year. Yes. So again, we all want to spend money on all sorts of things, but the money that you're spending on eating and drinking and general childcare, because you choose to have childcare as a lifestyle choice, all that money is money that you would anyway want to spend. So that doesn't get deducted from your income. But the money that you're spending directly in order to allow you to earn your money, that's coming off the net profit. The net profit of me working, I have to deduct from that the money that I'm spending in order to get to work, or the money that I'm spending on the work itself. If my work demands me to buy my own computing system, then again that money is being used to buy the computing system, and therefore I wouldn't have to spend I would deduct that from my income before I do the Maaser calculations. Okay, so this is someone who's earning a fixed salary. If someone is running a business, then again, every so often they would have to do a calculation of what the net profit of the business is and take Maaser from the net profit. If they are leaving capital in the business because the business needs continued investment and they are only drawing down certain amounts of capital out of the business to provide them for their income, again, they would take Maaser from that money that they're drawing out of the business. Now, on a practical level, all of this can get a little bit complicated. And as I mentioned last week, Halachot doesn't specify a time period within which you have to do the calculations. However, it's generally understood that one shouldn't use it too long, and a cheshbon should be made. And therefore, the presumption of the minhag is that one should do this calculation once a year. And there's no reason you can't align that with the tax year that's convenient for you. So if you're a regular taxpayer with a fixed income, once a year, probably April time, whatever, you'll have to work out what your income was. So you work out what your net income is post-tax, and then you will also do a calculation of how much you spent on commuting and on childcare, and if there were IT expenses associated with earning a living or whatever it is, and deduct that, and then you would take your Maaser from that. Now, on a practical level, it's probably worth setting up a direct debit every month that goes into your Tzedaka account. But at the end of the year, you'll tweak the figures and you'll check whether you'll do a guesstimate of what your direct debit should be. So you're not lumped with a big bill at the end of the year. So you do a rough estimate of what your Maaser calculation will be. And at the end of the year, you'll tweak it and realize that you've either overgiven Maaser or undergiven, and then you'll readjust your calculations. That's how you would do it with a fixed salary. Similarly with the business, where money's going in and out, once a year, when you're anyway doing your accounting of where the business is up to, then it would make sense to also do the calculation of how to take Maaser. What doesn't get deducted from your income? The answer is, for most people, your normal living expenses don't get deducted from your income. Why? Because that's not because of your working, that's just because of your life. So if you are earning, in our scenario, 100, and we take off 40 for tax and 10 for commuting and 20 for childcare, and you're left with 30, assuming in order to live a regular life, you need to spend £25 a year, and you've got an extra £5 a year that you use for savings or luxuries, you would take Maaser from that full 30 pounds a year. Even though you're using 25 of it for food and accommodations on, that's what you're using for yourself. That's your income, and that's what you have to take Maaser on. However, this is all assuming that one can make ends meet. If you need your full 30 in order just to survive, then you would be exempt from Maaser because you are an oni, or someone who needs the money in order to survive. In that case, one would be exempt from Maaser. Or you could, in a sense, put it differently, and this is how the Chafetz Chaim formulates it. You could say, in a sense, your first obligation of tzedakah is to yourself. So everyone has to give tzedakah. Even the person who's using the full 30 to live has to give some amount of money to tzedakah, but there wouldn't be an obligation of maaser. The obligation to tithe wouldn't apply to someone for whom tithing would push them over the poverty line. Now, what's defined as basic necessities? So this is what I spoke about in the Mesilah evening. That would depend on what's considered a normal quality of life in the time and place that you are living. So maybe 200 years ago, when all our ancestors lived in little hovels and huts in East Europe or North Africa, or wherever it may be, maybe being able to afford a basic hut with basic heating and enough firewood and plain food and so on, that would be considered a normal quality of life. In northwest London, thankfully, where we have an easier life, you don't need to say, I'm living in a flat. Why do I need a flat? I could, manage in a one-bedroom bedsit and I'd be okay. You can say what's considered a normal quality of life. So I appreciate that relies on your own sort of self-honesty and your estimation, but one can look and say what is a manageable, decent, normal quality of life in northwest London. It possibly would include a holiday every year or something like that. That's considered something normal. Very hard for us now not to have some sort of break and opportunity to take a holiday and so on. And then you would say, okay, income above that I will pay Maaser on, but I won't pay Maaser on anything below that because otherwise it will impoverish me and put me below the poverty line. So what's defined as a poverty line is what's considered a normal, reasonable quality of life in the area where one is living. Now, I appreciate in the context of northwest London, unfortunately, that is quite a high income, meaning it's an expensive part of the world to live, and people need to be able to live in from areas, and that means that they're living in one of the expensive areas. And so be it. It means, therefore, that a lot of people at the beginning of their career are possibly under the definition of an oni, in which case they would be exempt from Maaser on a large part or on all of their income, and that is the correct thing. Does that mean that they're giving no tzedakah? Categorically not. Every Jew is chayav to give tzedakah. But the addition of having to tithe Maaser, that's what I'm saying one is exempt from. And for various reasons, therefore, I suggest to people in that situation, take 3% of your income or something like that. So you're still giving a decent amount of Maaser, but you're not, a decent amount of tzedakah, but you're not tithing Maaser. Sorry, Julia.
Yeah, I was just like, the definition of funny because I thought it was very interesting how you said that just because I was just like more from an ethical point of view, wouldn't someone who has a housing, has food, so has all the necessities, like wouldn't they be considered just not as someone who is poor or like someone who's like homeless, sort of what would be, because like saying that just because you cannot give the charity makes you an oni.
So it is true that if you have two needy people in front of you, one of whom is homeless and one of whom has a roof over their head, the one who is homeless will come ahead. And we spoke when we learned the Halachot of order of priority: food, clothing, shelter. These are the hierarchy of needs. That is when I have two people in front of me that I need to allocate. Here, the question isn't my obligation to give tzedakah. I'm obligated to give tzedakah, even if I'm at the poverty level or below of what's considered a nice life in northwest London. If there's someone in front of me who is an impoverished person, absolutely I have to give them. But that's not our halachic discussion over here. The halachic discussion is: do I have to tithe and set aside Maaser? And for that, the obligation of Maaser only starts once I have enough for living regular life. What defines regular life? What's called regular within the world and circumstance that you live. So of course I am less needy than tragically the person who doesn't have anything, but that is the boundaries of chesed. There's a limit to the boundaries of chesed. The reality is we know sadly that in the third world and other places, there's people impoverished the whole time. So how can any of us justify any level of life that we're living? And this is the halacha that one's allowed a boundary in life in which one says, I need to have what's necessary for me to have a basic level of life before I start giving Maaser. So there's boundaries to all chesed that we do, and the boundary of the chiyuv of Maaser is only once I've crossed the threshold of what would be considered a normal quality of life. Now, again, I appreciate that can be wishy-washy. This isn't meant to be an open-ended clause to allow everyone to live in the lap of luxury before they have Maaser. But I still do like an honest judgment of what will be something that is reasonable to live with and will mean I have what's considered reasonable accommodation with reasonable food supply. I don't have to have bread and water in the time and place in which I'm living. Yeah. If you are, so in direct answer to your question, if you are making ends meet very comfortably, then no, rent is you choosing to spend money on yourself, but you still have to take Maaser beforehand. If you're not surviving, if your cost of getting through the year is 30, and therefore you can't take Maaser, then you can't take Maaser. You're still obligated in Tzedaka, even though that will involve sacrifice. That's Tzedaka. So yes, you'll have to give some Tzedaka and go below what's considered a reasonable level of life, but that would obligate you to give, pounds out, or 1 out of the 30. That doesn't obligate you to give 3 out of the 30. Yeah.
Two questions. So if you are saying, say you're earning 32, right, so you've got the 32, so is it, you take 10% from the whole 32, or is it 10% from the 10?
If you are earning, if you are, sorry, you're saying if your basic necessities.
Yeah, basic necessities. I like covered. Just clarifying, do you take 10% just from the excess amount, or you take from your?
For a normal person, you have to take 10% on your whole income if you can afford to do that and be comfortable. If you're on the poverty line, then stage 1 is just to take Maaser on the excess, and stage 2 is not to take Maaser at all. So it's again in our scenario, let's say you're earning 30, as we said, and the cost of getting to a regular life would be 29, then you'd only give 1 because that's the excess. If the cost of living is 30, you would give 0, but you'll still have to give some money to Tzedaka. Yeah. Right. Now, I think that, and this is, I recognize this as a significant leniency, but this makes sense to me, and I think this is correct. I think that in the context of life in London, and again, I mentioned this at the Masira event, where we do not have a culture of renting. It's very hard to rent for life in the UK. In Europe and other places, people do rent for life because there's greater protection of tenants. But in the UK, really the main, to be settled, one needs to be able to eventually get oneself onto the property ladder. If not, it's very difficult to ever become financially independent. And for many people, their property is their single biggest investment, and their pension funds, and effectively and other things. So I think if one wants to have a sustainable life in Northwest London, again, one probably needs to get onto the property ladder. And therefore, if one is still renting and doesn't have a worked out plan to get onto the property ladder, I think one is exempt from Maaser till one is able to get onto the property ladder. So if you have a clear and defined plan how within a reasonable amount of time, I'll be able to say, every month I'm saving something and I'll be able to get the deposit down, and within a reasonable amount of time, I'll be able to get into the property ladder, then one is obligated to Maaser. But until that point, I think, again, one is potter from Maaser, one is exempt from Maaser, because I do think in the context of North West London, one needs to be able to afford to save up and to be able to get onto the property ladder. So that's a summary of what one is obligated to give Maaser. One is not obligated to give Maaser on gifts, specific items or gifts that one's given. So if someone gives one a bar of chocolate, you don't have to count that as income. If someone gives you an oven or a fridge or a freezer or a car, one doesn't have to count that as income. Maaser is given on capital, which is yours to spend freely. It's not given on specific gifts. Similarly, if a relative gives you £500 and says, buy for yourself a fridge, you're not obligated to give Maaser on that, because they're allowing you to, they're effectively giving you a specific item, and the cash is just to spend on that. If a relative gives you £500 and says, buy anything with it, treat yourself to something nice, then you would have to give Maaser on that, because that would count as income. Someone who is living off money given to them by their parents, the normal assumption would be that the parents wish to support them and don't expect them to be giving away the money on a significant basis to Maaser. And therefore, unless one has checked with one's parents, the assumption would be that one doesn't spend, effectively you're on oni, you're impoverished, and they're very kindly looking after you, but you can't give Maaser on their account. If they're giving you more than enough to live, and they're happy for you to do so, then you should give Maaser on that, of course. But if they're just giving you to live, and they're trusting you to let them know if you don't need the money, then the assumption would be that you're impoverished. They're very kindly looking after you, and therefore you do not need to give, and you shouldn't give away their money to Maaser. That's not what they're giving the money for, because they're supporting your day-to-day life. So it's different to the gift. The person who's giving the gift of £500 and saying spend on what you want, you're obligated to Maaser. But the person who's regularly supporting you, it's not an income, it's someone very kindly supporting you from their money. They may be giving you Tzedaka in a sense, they're doing chesed and looking after you, but the assumption would be that you're not giving Maaser on that, even though it's yours to choose what you on what you spend it. Yeah.
I just have a question, please. So in the past, so I'm from Sweden, and in the past, they used to pay people in coins, but also in salmon. So would you have to take Maaser on your salmon? Sorry.
Yes. So if someone is giving you, if a salary is being given directly in food, and you're going to eat that food, you'd be exempt from Maaser from that. If a salary is given in food, and the assumption is you're going to sell the food and use that to earn money, then when you sell it, you're now making a profit off it, and therefore at that stage you would be obligated to give Maaser. So someone told me, for example, they were clearing out their house, and they had all sorts of clutter that they'd accumulated, who knows from where, over the years, and were selling that now on eBay. So as they bring in income from that, they're obligated to give Maaser on that because they're now drawing capital down from that. They were also selling some objects which they had bought and were now trying to sell. Now, these objects which they had bought and were now trying to sell, they only have to take Maaser on the net profit. So if they bought it for £5 and they're selling it for £8, they have to take Maaser on that. If they bought it for £5 and they're selling it for £3, there's no Maaser to take at all. So each case will need to be worked out on a case-by-case basis. Correct. If you do barter, you wouldn't have to do, yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm writing down. Okay. 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 So that's the that's what one takes Maaser on, and what one is obligated to give. I'll just mention, I won't go into this in too much detail. If you are receiving government handouts and have enough to live off them comfortably, so a pension, disability benefit, or the like, child benefit, or the like, one would take Maaser on that. That's also income, and therefore one would be obligated to pay Maaser on that. Again, normally people are receiving government handouts is because they're not making enough ends meet, and therefore they'd be exempt from Maaser. But if they are, then they would be obligated. Yeah.
University loan, I mean, they want to, what if, say you get a movement or something, like money in exchange for and also separately, what if it's something like a grant?
Okay, so let's take them on one. The assumption with the loan is that you're not obligated to Maaser because you have to pay it back, even though a university loan you may end up not paying back. A grant, again, if the grant has been given for specific research or whatever, they're not. If it's been given for you to live and you have enough to live off, then that would count as income, and you'll take Maaser. If it's been given to you to live and you need it to make ends meet, then it wouldn't count as income and it'd be not obligated to Maaser. Pension, by the way, deducted at source is a complicated business. It's difficult to work out how to handle that. So in our scenario where you're earning £100 a year, and let's say you're paying £40 for tax, you've only got 60 income, and then let's say another 10 is going straight to your pension saving funds. So the reason it's complicated is because a pension doesn't, the way a pension works is it's not that all the money is sitting in a pot and one day you'll get that money back. It's that the money goes into investment funds and you'll then draw income after you retire until you die. So you'll either get all the money back that you put in, or much less if you die young, or much more if you live to be very elderly. So normally speaking, the simplest way to think of this halachically is that since this is deducted at source, you would not take Maaser from it. But one day when you draw down your pension, at that point, you would continue to take Maaser from your pension. So you would only take, let's say you're earning 100, 40 is taken in tax, and then 10 goes to your pension. So your net income would be 50, and you'll take £5 Maaser on the 50. And one day when you retire, and every year you get £25, and you'll take £2.5 as Maaser on the money that you're getting allocated from your pension. That's the simplest understanding of this. If one hasn't taken Maaser till now, as I mentioned last week, one should start taking Maaser, and one should do so b'li in order to avoid some of the halachic problems. One does not need to take Maaser on all one's previous wealth. Without going into the halachic details, that would be unsustainable, and therefore the postscript of the view that you do not need to take Maaser. So if you have significant wealth accumulated, you're exempt from Maaser. But in principle, Maaser is taken both on capital and on income. So if you have a large amount of capital that you just received, you would take Maaser on that. and then you would take Maaser on all income. However, capital which you're already sitting on, and for whatever reason you didn't take Maaser, one would be exempt from Maaser on that. You asked me, I think, about tax. I think I've dealt with that now.
Money there, was that, let's say I just didn't give Maaser and that's in the past, so it doesn't count?
So if you knew about Maaser and for some reason you didn't get around to it, you should take Maaser now. If someone is a Baal Teshuvah and never knew about Maaser and has now learned about it and would then have to go back and look at all their previous income, you're exempt from Maaser in that case. Yeah. I also discussed last week, because you did ask me about this, I said that the best way to take Maaser is to have the money immediately moved into a special Tzedaka account, and then use that to distribute Tzedaka as and when you work out need. And I mentioned that there isn't, some poskim think there's a time period by using an analogy to the laws of tithing, agricultural tithing, but the majority of poskim do not think there's a specific time period actually allocated when you have to distribute the Maaser. So when do you have to distribute it? Well, first of all, it should be clear, just because you've separated the money, you haven't yet done the mitzvah tzedakah. And therefore, my response to you was that you have to get on and do the mitzvah. You shouldn't leave the money sitting there forever. There's no specific halachic time period of when you have to give the money, but you shouldn't leave the money sitting around forever. One should make sure one gets on with it and distributes it. You then ask me, well, what would happen if you died before you distributed? Then you went and done the mitzvah tzedakah. So your estate distributing the money doesn't help, because it's not your money anymore. In halachic terms, as soon as a person dies, they lose their possessions, and the possessions go on to their inheritors, and therefore one has an obligation. One should give the tzedakah money. All I meant last week is there's no specific, according to most poskim, there's no specified time as to when I need to do it. One should get on with the job like all mitzvahs, the reason doing the mitzvahs, and make sure that the money is distributed in a timely manner. Yeah.
So usually it's only Maaser if you actually donate the money in the end. What if you've been saving up to donate, but then you end up losing your job, and therefore you now are an oni, and therefore you like giving that money to yourself? Would that still be considered Maaser, or?
Because this is an excellent question. Normally speaking, Maaser is taken within a time period that's not according to most poskim, not specified in halacha, but once separated off for tzedakah, has to then be given to other people, cannot be used for yourself. So since at the time you were earning the money, you thought you were secure in your job, and the reasonable expectation was you would continue earning, therefore you were obligated in Maaser, and now that unexpectedly you lost your job, at that point this is true, you are no longer obligated in Maaser, but the money already tithed for tzedakah should be given to, would need to be given for tzedakah still, and therefore couldn't be used for oneself, yeah. Actually, in line with your question, what are we allowed to spend Maaser on? So as I already said, Maaser takes a broader definition of what's called charity, and it can be used for all the regular tzedakah needs, so someone who's poor, assisting people to get married, pidyon shavurim, freeing a captive, bikkur cholim, but it can also be used for other broader needs. It can be used for sforim, buying sforim, for building a shul, building a school, chesed projects, hachmasas orachim, any worthy cause, any voluntary worthy cause, it can be used for. However, it can't be used for things which are obligatory, things that I need to do. So it can't be used for my regular eating and accommodation, and it can't be used for my mitzvah obligations, because my mitzvah obligations are obligations. They're part of my needs. So I need an esrog and a lulav, and I need a menorah, and I need matzah and pesach, and I need food and, carrots and housing in order to live. So these are all needs, and therefore tzedakah Maaser money can't be spent on those. So Maaser money can't be spent on my needs. It can be spent on voluntary or additional chesed activities that I am doing. Support for parents, care for parents. Normally speaking, one wouldn't use Maaser money for that. It would both be considered the lack of kibbutz of the aim, and it's an obligation that one should support one's look after one's parents. If, however, one is unable to afford to do so, then one could use tzedakah money or Maaser money to do that. But otherwise, normally one wouldn't.
Another person possibly considered a sibling, or is it just, or would a sibling or a cousin also be considered?
So in principle, relative to the best charity begins at home, as we discussed when we learned tzedakah, And therefore, in principle, if one has siblings or parents or children who are impoverished, one could give tzedakah to them and use it. Just normally speaking, if one's able to afford so, it wouldn't be considered covered to one's parents to use tzedakah money for it, and one has an obligation to give it. If one can't, then one absolutely can use Maaser money for that. And certainly for other relatives. In fact, this is considered the first priority of tzedakah, to give to relatives. Relatives come ahead of anyone else. So these are the sorts of things that tzedakah money should be spent for. In fact, if we talk about the order of priority, as we already said, it can be used for all worldly causes, and so on and so forth, and also the same rules as we spoke about previously when we learned the halachas. So it would go to one's relatives first. If you remember the psukim that we looked at when we first started Tilta Tzedaka, it indicated that it goes to relatives. Bishorecho indicated that people who live in one city come first. Then we spoke about Aniyim of Eretz Yisrael as the next priority, and in the regular order of priority that we discussed. We discussed how parents come ahead of children, children come ahead of siblings, and so on and so forth. So everything that we discussed when we learned Tzedaka was all applied in the order of prioritization for Maaser.
About things which kind of say they have charities, but are not necessarily for people.
So you can use Maaser for all of those, and that's in a sense the difference between Tzedaka and Maaser. Maaser is Tzedaka and Tzedaka is Maaser. But I explained there was a difference in the sense that when the Torah speaks about Tzedaka, it's talking about an impoverished person whose hands needs that. The truth is, a lot of charities also are really impoverished people ultimately. So when you're giving money to a hospital, very often it's to pay the medical care of someone who's too poor to pay for themselves. But it might be used for research. Now, research is a good thing, but that's not what the Torah classically calls tzedakah. So when we talk about the mitzvah of tzedakah in the purest sense of the word, we mean a needy person who's in front of me. That's the pasuk that talks about in Kesef Talda, when there's a needy person who needs a loan or a needy person who needs tzedakah in front of me. Those were the pasukim that we looked at. Maaser, though, is a broader category than that, and you can use Maaser money for what we would call a general charitable need. So it's not a poor person to pay for a shul to have a building, or to pay for Sfarim, or to pay for Talmud Torah, or to pay for hospital research. But these are good things, and therefore Maaser money can be used for that. Not Sfarim for your own use, because that's your own needs. If you're supporting it as a place of Talmud Torah, then yes. Yeah.
How much you can benefit from it? So if you organize like an event or Shabbos and stuff, and use it Maaser, and it's small, and I use it Maaser, and I also enjoy it. Is it?
So the amount that you are directly benefiting from it wouldn't count as Maaser, but everything else would. So yeah, you're absolutely right. An online website. I want to support Chabad.org or Sefaria, or whatever it is. That would be Maaser. It's not the classic tzedakah of an oni approaching me, but it's a worthy cause. It's a vehicle for Talmud Torah, and therefore that would be legitimate. Correct. So again, that would all be good Maaser, even though it's not necessarily an oni. There's no specific impoverished person whom you're supporting by doing that.
So, like for example, Sefaria, like I'm going to end up.
It doesn't matter that you're benefiting from it, because they don't charge; they're free to the user, and therefore everything I'm giving is a donation, even though I benefit from it. Yeah, absolutely.
What about raising money for a product for a program?
Same thing. Again, that would be Maaser. If it's a worthy cause, it depends what the program is. If the program is to allow them to go skiing, not. But if it's a worthy cause, something, yeah, then that would be, yeah.
A child into a parent's school, and it's very good. Except for about a parent who's supporting some children, who are married, whatever. Does that kind of Maaser for the parent? Can they use Maaser money to support their children?
Yes, if parents are supporting children, let's say to allow their children to on a voluntary basis, and they're not doing what's considered basic. If you look in classic Tzedaka, it even talks about supporting children from a young age as counting as Tzedaka. Now, I think nowadays the posting aren't so comfortable with that, because there's an expectation on parents to support children till they enter into young adult, till they finish childhood. Once a child finishes childhood and they're now studying or whatever, in most of society, that's not considered an expectation of the parent to support. the parents are doing tzedakah for their children, and therefore would be allowed to do that. And certainly, if they're supporting the children to, I don't know, after they're married for a year to be able to learn an Eretz Yisrael or something like that, that would certainly count as tzedakah, because that's directly supporting them in the Talmud Torah. The poskim do say one should make sure not to become selfish. So don't use all your money for supporting family in that way, because you can end up using all your master money in that respect. Master money can be used for anything which is voluntary. So there's a lot of discussion amongst the poskim about school fees. Now, the reason for this discussion is because parents are obligated to care for their children, and part of that mitzvah is Talmud Torah, to teach them Torah. And therefore, you would think that you can't use Maaser for that, because that's an obligation to support your children. However, here in the UK, we are lucky because you can educate your children in secular and Torah for free. And the reason for this is the way the state school system works in the UK, where you can get secular education for free. And there are many state-aided voluntary contribution schools, which effectively means the schools offer Kodesh also at no cost, even though they encourage you and you have a moral obligation to pay voluntary contributions. But these are ultimately voluntary contributions. They can't take you to court to pay for it. They can't demand it of you. And the government has therefore agreed to recognize these as tax deductible through gift aid. And the reason for that is because ultimately, as much as the schools would beg and plead for you to pay, they cannot turn away a child and will not turn away a child. And education is absolutely free to anyone who does that. The school is frustrated. They rely on parents to help them. That's what it means to be voluntary aided. But ultimately, it's a voluntary contribution. And the tax regime recognizes that the government recognizes that, and the school recognizes that. They don't have the ability to ask a child to lead as a result, and no school will do so. And therefore, you can deduct your child's school fees from tzedakah, from Maaser money, because it's all voluntary. Probably, even if you're choosing to send your child to a private school where the fees are not voluntary, nonetheless, even then it could be deducted from Maaser, because you're choosing to pay extra to get them a better education that you wish them to get. But again, that would count as tzedakah, since it's above and beyond the basic needs. So here in the UK, where we have access to free education, not just free education, but even free Torah education, therefore effectively Torah can be taught at no cost to parents. Anything parents are spending on schooling would count as Maaser. Similarly, shul membership fees, it's discussed a lot in the poskim. That was in the olden days where shuls would turn people away who weren't paying fees. So everyone bought their seat, and if you didn't buy a seat, you had nowhere to sit in the shul. Nowadays, no shul, most shuls don't operate like that. Shuls are basically free for use, but they rely on people who are using the shul to do the honourable thing and choose to become a member of the shul. But effectively, you could daven in the shul for years and go to the shiurim and daven in the shul, and people may have you often approach and say, would you consider becoming a member? And if you say no, they're not going to kick you out. So in such a shul, again, membership fees can be paid out of Maaser money, because the shul at the end of the day, we don't turn people away who aren't going to pay. The exception may be if the shul on, let's say, Yomim Noraim, often shuls at that point are so full to the seams that they will say members only, or you have to pay for a seat if you're not a member. In that case, that money wouldn't be able to be taken from Maaser, because then you are effectively buying a service. Even then many shuls, certainly our shul, if someone said, look, I can't pay, wouldn't turn you away. So effectively, we are doing it as free at use, and therefore Maaser money can be used.
So then I don't understand, why would a private school be able to take my put your child in the public school instead? Like, why is paying private fees okay to use Maaser, but like if you have to put it,
because correct, but since you could choose not to, the basic care for children doesn't demand of you to pay school fees, because you could access free education, and therefore if you need to, according to most poskim, you could use Maaser money for that. You have an obligation as a parent to provide for your children and to educate them in Torah, but the education of the Torah is at a good level, is accessible at no cost, and therefore you are choosing on a voluntary basis to educate them maybe at a higher level because you want them to have a private rebbe or you want them to go to a private school. That's your choice, and therefore you could use Maaser money for that.
and in America, where, like for example, where there is no public Torah learning environment.
So that environment would be where the poskim discuss whether Maaser can or cannot be used for education, because parents have an obligation to educate their children. And there's some places can say they only have an obligation to educate children to a very basic level or to a young age. Once children are above 6, they don't have an obligation. So that's the discussion in poskim on an international level. Here in the UK, where we're fortunate enough to have free education accessible to everyone at a good level, you don't have to. And Torah, including Torah, obviously, because parents have an obligation to teach their children Torah, you don't have to pay for that. So some yeshiva would come out of Maaser, could come out of Maaser money again, correct? Yes, it can, because it's an extra. As far as broader society is concerned, your children hit 17, 18, they're off your head. You're choosing to send them to yeshiva, that would certainly fall in that category. Yeah. I should mention, just for the sake of, you were asking about hosting, sorry, and I said you can use Maaser for the extra, but not for what you're benefiting from. So the classic example that was used for this, pre-COVID, people used to make charity dinners there. They've gone out of fashion now a little bit. But let's say you're invited to a charity dinner and they charge you £200 to attend. Now, you know that the reason you're willing to pay that amount isn't because that's what you would pay for a nice meal. It's because you want to give money to Tzedaka. So in theory, the way to work it out would be as follows. You'd say, what would I spend for the nice meal? £20, £30. So £30 is for my own needs. I get a nice meal out of it. That's buying my own food. And £170 is what I'm giving to Tzedaka. And therefore that £170 would count for my Maaser calculations. That's how it would work.
For example, like inviting students to Shabbos meal, would that be able to be something?
For your own Shabbos meal?
Yeah, and you're inviting students, or other.
So inviting other people again would be so that would be hachnos hazarchim, and then you could use that for Maaser money. But your own meal not, because that's your need. If you're inviting people because you just like socializing with them, again that wouldn't be Maaser. If you're inviting people because they're alone, let's say students who are alone or living out of away from home, then that would definitely be hachnos hazarchim, and that would count. Yeah.
So I just want to actually said it's stand for yeshiva, you can pay for the Maaser.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Because it's for someone else.
It's for someone else, it's for your children, and you don't. That's above and beyond what a parent has an obligation to do. Once there's a discussion in the posting at what age a parent loses responsibility for children, and then there's discussion which is, does it depend by a fixed amount as determined by the posting or what's normal in your society? But everyone would agree once a child hits 17, 18. Parents don't have an obligation to support their child anymore. There's no societal expectation that you have to do that. And therefore, that definitely could count from Maaser money. If it's for oneself, in principle, you shouldn't be using Maaser money for that because you have a need to learn Torah. However, if the only way you can afford to do so is using Maaser money, again, I think a good Jewish education is a basic need, and therefore you would be considered impoverished if you can't afford to use it. You do it, and therefore you could use Maaser money or be exempt from Maaser in order to allow you to do it. So in the same way as I think getting onto property ladder is a necessity, I think everyone having had a chance to learn Torah in depth is a need, and therefore if for whatever reason you weren't able to go to them earlier, I think that's a legitimate need to fund it later. Yeah.
But isn't a school, you said it's to pay for a school membership because it's obligated.
Yes.
People that come to school, it's obligated.
Yeah.
So wouldn't that also be a need because you're going to school to learn Torah?
It would be, except shuls give their services in the UK for free.
Okay.
Meaning, even though we want people to pay, and it's frustrating for shul that people use the service without paying, no shul is going to turn you away, and if it's voluntary. A yeshiva and SEM will turn you away if you don't pay, unless you apply for bursary or get a stipend. Otherwise, they simply can't afford to do so. And therefore, that's a need. You can't get that service without paying, and it's a need, and therefore, correct. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that brings us to an end of Maaser. I hope the recording worked. I seem to have had problems with the audio. So we'll finish that. I'm open for nominations, and we'll put it on the group for what our next A to Z series should be. So we're doing the A to Z of mitzvahs, so I'm open for suggestions on mitzvahs if anyone has suggestions now or you want to tell me later. But I'm just putting that out there. So for next week, we'll start a new series. Okay.
Also, you didn't speak about if you're allowed to give more than 10%, but because the money.
Okay, thank you. So I'll speak about that. Yes, I'll mention that also. In Halachot, it says that one can give more than 10%. but only up to 20%, not more than 20%. And the reason is Shema Ye Oni, lest you become poor yourself if you give away too much tzedakah. We were speaking about boundaries before. There's a boundary of how much tzedakah one should give. You shouldn't give more than 20%, Shema Ye Oni. Either that means literally because you'll become impoverished, you're giving too much away, or because you'll have a disincentive to work. We know that if tax rates go too high, people have a disincentive to work, and that's for Shema Ye Oni. So generally speaking, one shouldn't give more than a fifth to tzedakah. There's a machlokus between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, whether someone who's extraordinarily wealthy can give more than 20%. So someone who's just run of the mill, very comfortable, should not give more than 20%. What happens if you're Bill Gates and you've got 50 billion? That would be a machlokus whether you can give more than 20% or not.
Well, what if it's like you like for example, I know that Tzedaka and also separate things. Like every time someone who's an ani asks you for money, you have to give. But you're giving so much to an ani because there are several anis who have asked you several times, and you need to say yes every single time, that it gets to a point where it's going up above 20%. Is it possible to go above that 20%?
It is possible if there's an oni lefonacha, if there's a specific person asking you, yes.
It's above 20% to the point of where you're getting impoverished.
Then not, because Shema Yoni means you may be impoverished yourself if you give about 20%. If you're actually getting impoverished, you're exempt from what can you do? You don't have the money.
Yeah,
and that's what we spoke about. We spoke about stock. Give a token to some, but don't give more. Yeah. Okay. I wish everyone a good day. Thank you so much for joining.